So that's sensation, extroverted sensing. Let's talk about the other attitude of sensing. That's sensing extroverted. Let's talk about sensing introverted. There's two flavors of introverted sensing, what we've nicknamed as memory for Personality Hacker. Now, memory or introverted sensing is all about the sensory impressions over time. It's about tracking those sensory impressions, noticing them. They're both inside of us as people. Like we have a sense of our past and what's come before. But we also can use external markers to track things, paperwork. There's metrics and standards and all these kinds of things that we use to keep track of the changes over time as well. And this is something that memory or introverted sensing people are often focused on, is those nuanced changes over time and noticing those and tracking them both inside the self and also in the world at large.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's a vast storehouse of sensory impressions, which is why those changes can be tracked, because there's a good memory for the detail of how it once was and the impression that gave a person. And then when it changes, it gives a different impression. So if you're focused in on those impressions, you're going to notice all those subtle changes. And I really like how Dario talks about introverted sensing or memory. I think it's a slightly different way than I've thought about it traditionally, but it's a desire to help people be civil, right? It's like, it's
interoperability of humans.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Its civilization is built on interoperability.
Yes.
Right. And standards.
Yeah.
Effectively. And so it's, we have a certain standard of tire size. Thank goodness. Right. And that helps us be civil when we are refitting tires on our car, because think about how frustrating it would be if there was 4 billion different kinds of tires. And like, I can totally imagine that weirdly. I mean, maybe my intuition is just jumping and leaping, but it's like that could end up in fistfights, right? The inability to find a tire for your car could get maddening.
I suppose it could.
Yeah. And so it's like
among a lot of other outcomes.
Right. Well, I mean, things are already frustrating, right? Yeah. So it's like, so just the ability to go get like, oh, this is the standard tire size for your car, and this is what you'll need. Yeah. And maybe it's so expensive you want to punch the person, but you don't, and you get your tires and it's fine.
Now that you've said it, this really is the threat of Western democracy. If I'm thinking about it, tire sizes and standards of tires. Like if we don't have that dialed in, we could lose it all.
Well, think about everything that is standardized, right? And I can think of so many different things. And I think I just walk through the world punching people out of frustration and anger. So tire size being the example used to indicate all the things that are being unmentioned.
Yeah, and when we don't have it, I mean, I think in terms of the early days of some of the digital video formats, I'm not even going back to the 80s with VHS versus beta. That's one of them. But I mean, in the past 15, 20 years, we've gotten better at the codecs and all the ways that we encode video. But for a while there in the mid 2000s, there were like all these options. And it was kind of like, well, which one do you want to choose? And it's, well, which one's going to be the one of the future? That's the one I want to choose. We didn't know. And so people would accommodate for that and have a lot of different things running and reverse engineer stuff. But now we're starting to get down to standardization around this. And it's actually helping things go better, because if I work with a videographer across the world, they send us a file, they're probably going to film it in the way we need it filmed so we can use it here. So it's actually a good thing that memory and introverted sensing does for us at that level. It helps us make things work across larger groups of people.
For sure. So the analytic version of this function, Dario calls it the defender.
Yeah.
And it's because it is fundamentally protecting civilization. Right. The things you're talking about, the standards, the interoperability, the capacity to have civilization, which it's a fragile thing, actually. Right. It needs defending. The ability. I mean, I don't want to date this podcast too much, but I guess it's not really dating the podcast, because we've been in the midst of all of this turmoil for years now. Right. And we are observing right now just how fragile civilization is, right? Yeah. How easy it can be taken, how much damage and destruction can happen in very small amounts of time that change the fabric of everything. And the defender, the analytic version of introverted sensing or memory, is designed to make sure that those don't happen too quick, that they happen at a pace where we can all keep up with it, so that we don't lose what has taken centuries to build, right? It's a fragile thing, and it needs people to protect it.
When it's missing, people get confused and they're open for hijacking. I think during the pandemic was a good example of this. We lost a lot of our introverted sensing memory. No one was doing their normal routines. No one had their normal life at the time. You were even watching things on television. You're watching people that you'd normally see in a studio doing it from their homes. Wow, that's weird and different. I'm not used to this. This is nothing like I'm familiar with. And so it creates this soil for mass change to happen and people to be very confused and a lot of chaos to be injected into the system.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we've seen in the vacuum of it going away for a short period of time, we've seen just how useful it is when it is there. I've come to appreciate it much more after going through the pandemic and watching what happened.
Absolutely. Yep. And Dario says, it doesn't necessarily mean nice, traditional, or orderly. This analytic version isn't necessarily those things. They're not necessarily hysterical about safety. They know there are times when you need to court danger or go to war. So let's do that smartly and purposefully.
Yeah.
So it's not a resistance to all change. It's not a resistance to doing what needs to be done. It's a resistance to rushing into things, making changes too quickly, undermining the fabric of all of these, all of these institutions that we have. And that's what's distressing to the defender version of it, of introverted sensing. So one thing also I want to mention is that they do not the one thing I didn't want to mention, but I do want to, now that I'm thinking about it, is there does tend to be a traditional bent, right? They don't have to be traditional, but there does tend to be a traditional bent because traditions are part of keeping civilization going.
I would use the word consistency.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe even more than tradition.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think there's a desire to have consistency. And if the change can be made or the altercation can be made to keep some kind of consistent framework, the change is accepted.
Mm-hmm.
But the consistency is the most important. I think traditions help us keep consistency, but consistency is the metric.
Right. Well, and traditions are also the things we bake into ourselves,
Personal.
Our sense impressions. They become personal. Exactly. Yeah. So consistency, I do believe, is really important. I think the reason why they tend to be traditional, though, is because it personalizes it.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I'm speaking specifically to the interoperability of it all.
Right.
Not the personal sense of impressions that we take with us, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so to clarify all of that, it is the personal sense impressions that are the foundation of all of it.
Yes.
And traditions are very easy to bake into one's identity.
Correct.
And to the things that mean something to us.
Yes.
So there does tend to be a traditional component, but they don't necessarily have to be. It just tends to be that way because it's one of the easiest ways to be consistent and keep the interoperability of this institutions we've created that allow for that consistency.
Personal traditions, outer interoperability.
Yes. And that means being tapped into not just the personal traditions, but societal and cultural traditions.
Yeah.
That's where the interoperability comes from, right?
Yep.
And so it's baking in personally what is culturally common.
Yep.
Right. And there's a groundedness to that, right? He also mentions, and this is the one thing that I was going to say a long time ago. The one thing I want to mention about this specifically is that there is an association of introverted sensing or memory. A lot of people have an impression that it's about like sequencing or doing things in a certain order or, stabilizing and that sort of thing. And he mentions that sequencing and recalling factual details shows up more with the analytic version because sequencing is an analytic tendency. So it's not that the function itself is necessarily focused on sequencing. It's focused on sequencing when it's analytic because analytic is focused on sequencing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. And so then we tend to see it in that way when it's manifest. And I think the analytic versions of each of these functions are the more obvious because they're pushing out. They're louder. They're more in your face. They're more directed.
They're easier to define when you're writing Myers-Briggs type material for the internet or recording content for the internet or anywhere else, or you're writing a book.
Yep.
It makes more sense from an economic business model standpoint. You're writing a book trying to get a concept across. You're creating content for somebody in an article. you're going to probably favor the analytic version because it's easier to define and articulate to someone.
Yeah. Well, and they're just more obvious and easier to pick out.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's the version of it. That's a version of it. But it might not be the function that's being observed. It might be the analytic preference
Energy.
that's being. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Okay. So let's go to the holistic version of introverted sensing or memory. This one is, I think, this one I believe is the assumption is it's associated with feeling. And I think people think that the analytic version of sensing is associated with thinking. So that's another distinction I want to make here is that we get an impression of, say, ISTJs maybe as always being more of the analytic version. And I think the assumption is that it's introverted sensing when paired with extroverted thinking or effectiveness. That's what creates that analytic. And then the holistic, which we're about to go into, is more like introverted sensing or memory when paired with extroverted feeling or harmony. I think that's the bias that we have, or the blind spot in the type community, when really it doesn't matter what your judging preferences are. It doesn't matter whether you're a thinker or a feeler. You can have analytic introverted sensing or memory, even if you're an ISFJ. And you can have a holistic introverted sensing or memory, even if you're an ISTJ. So I think that's one of the big distinctions I got. I went, oh, that's a mistake I made. Yeah. I married the holistic version with feeling, but it's not.
Yeah.
Right. So all of that said.
Well, and I think just to your point, I mean, we've seen so many students come through our profiler training program. We're actually baking this into some of the core content now because it's very easy to mistype or misprofile somebody. If you're sitting down with a profiling session, if you don't have this at least in your head to watch out for, you go, oh, well, that must be this type over here. Whoa. It could still be a feeling type that's more analytic bent. It's not necessarily an ISTJ.
Yep.
Maybe it's an ISFJ.
Yep.
That you're just seeing more analytic come from.
Yep.
So that's something we've been working with our students on a lot lately to get really better at the methodology when we're live profiling somebody.
Yep, you got it. Okay, so all of that said, let's talk about the holistic introverted sensing or memory.
I feel like there's so many hyperlinks and footnotes on this podcast. We're like, caveat this, parenthetical this.
That might just be us too.
All right, fair enough. Right. Let's keep going.
All right, so Dario calls the holistic introverted sensing or memory function the Hearth.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily anchored in any specific thing, unlike the analytic version, which is anchored in like civilization and maybe specific protocols or traditions, or like you mentioned, things that are interoperable. This is an anchoring to everything. He called it a table or a chair with 1,000 legs. It's very rooted. It's very grounded. It's very stabilized because it's the person's individual sense impressions that are baked into everything they've ever experienced. So if you take one away, they might not like that you took it away, but it's not going to change much for them because they have all these other sense impressions, all these other things that they're grounded to. That it's like you can't ruffle them almost. You can't destabilize by taking any one thing away from them. So they tend to be a little bit more open to change, interestingly enough. Because if you rock the boat over here, it's like, I don't like that the boat is getting rocked, but I'm going to roll with it because it's not like you can destabilize me on all these other 999 things. So, okay, let's go ahead and change in that one way, right? And I'll figure it out. It's just this profound rootedness in the self and one's impressions. And so instead of being more of a defender and an anchor, it's more of like a warm rootedness. It's more like the hearth, right? It's like it's the center of it all. And at the center of it all is your entire life of impressions, right? But they're very personal to you. And that's one of the ways that it's not so assertive, because it's not trying to make this happen for everybody else. It's the self that's rooted in it.
And really it's weird because the person analytic might be more focused on interoperability outside of the self. But because of the analytic nature of introverted sensing or memory being focused on that, it probably has, let's just say it's got 5 ways to be interoperable. I'm oversimplifying, but let's just say it has 5 ways because it's focused on it. But the holistic introverted sensing or memory person, or this function, no matter where it falls in somebody's personality, this actually might be more interoperable because it's much more receptive and it'll play nice with almost anyone.
Mm-hmm.
So even though it's not focused as much on being interoperable, it's more focused on the self and the sensory impressions.
Mm-hmm.
How I see it is it probably has the tendency to be open more to more variances than
Mm-hmm.
the function if it was focused on interoperability, which is so weird. It's kind of like counterintuitive. It's like the photo negative of itself almost. So I thought that was very interesting as I was looking through this material.
Yeah. And it's the holistic users that are more likely to be tuned into all those subtle changes like we talked about, because Dario says their database is so big and things are not just pushed into a box.
Yeah.
So they're the ones who are more likely to be very detail oriented about everything. He said, asking, is it black or white, is more of an analytic, introverted sensing or memory way of asking a question. To the holistic version, they see a palette of 64 million colors, right? There's so many different, all of this variance, because again, it's like what they're rooted in is a huge variety of things, right? It's a table with 1,000 legs.
Diffused.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so everything evokes something a little different, right? And that means that all those subtle changes are going to evoke something a little different inside of them. My suspicion is it's a lot of holistic introverted sensing or memory users are the ones who do create really lovely environments for people. And I think that's probably why they're more tapped into that hearth quality.
Mm-hmm.
There's a desire for comfort. There's a little bit more of a desire for comfort with this style than the analytic. The analytic takes more hits for to ensure that they're defending something. So they're willing to take more arrows to their comfort. The holistic version is more likely to create comfort and not allow you to take their comfort from them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
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 So there's like there's a subtle difference here. And it means that both allow for some changes. One, because change is inevitable and they've got to defend the important parts within that change. And the other one is because even when you change, you can't take it. You can't take their comfort from them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's a flowing nature to this, as there is with all the holistic functions, right? There's kind of like a flow to all of this. And you see this with extroverted sensing or sensation. There's like a flow to life. It's like, I think Dario calls it an effortless flow, where you just sort of flow through the experiences of life. There's a flow of rolling with life, right? Like rolling with the punches, rolling with the changes, being willing to absorb them and kind of find your way in all of it, that the holistic version has, which is an attractive quality in that function. There's also a sense that he mentions that a hearth can be taken anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the groundedness inside the holistic version of this function, is that I always think of it in terms of, for myself, because I have it as an inferior fourth function, or my 3-year-old in my car model. I think of it as like the rhythms and routines of my life.
Well,
right?
A hearth can be taken anywhere. I think of scooping up the coals and taking them where you go, and like recreating the hearth, that feeling, that energy, that warmth, no matter where you are.
Exactly.
You root yourself back there and you restart a fire. I mean, a metaphorical fire.
Exactly.
Wherever you go.
And I think of it as like routines and habits and rituals that can be taken with me no matter where I go. Right.
Yeah.
So I don't need this house, but I need some components that are familiar to me that I can take from this house to the next. And then I can reestablish that hearth. So that's part of the role with the punches, is the ability to kind of drop and then pick up the important rhythms, the important routines, the important elements that keep my life stable and going. That's more of that holistic version.
Whereas I think an analytic introverted sensing or memory is going to feel less of a bend and more of a break. Like when a change has to happen, it probably feels a little bit more cutting, a little more severe, a little more like, I got that taken from me, or that change was forced upon me.
Yes.
I didn't like that. I wish I was more in control of that change, or it didn't happen at all, and pushing it away, a little more resistance.
Yep.
than maybe the holistic side of it.
Right, exactly. And each side has some, just we'll go through all the functions. Each side has something to offer.
Yeah.
Right. And so if introverted sensing or memory is not one of your first two functions, again, just like with extroverted sensing or sensation, which side do you have a tendency to, to lean towards, and what lesson does the other side afford for you?
Yeah.
Like I definitely have a holistic version of introverted sensing or memory for sure. There are things that have happened to me that I should have been more of a defender around.
Mm-hmm.
Like I should have been less roll with the punches. There's an advantage to rolling with the punches, but there's also an advantage to having boundaries and not letting people push you around, which the defender version is less likely to be pushed around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I'm analytic in my memory, introverted sensing. So ENFP preferences is my 3-year-old or fourth function, inferior function. In my cognitive function stack. And I definitely have an analytic bent toward it. It is much more when change happens and I'm not in control of it or I haven't managed it, I get upset. I feel like something happened to me. I feel like somebody's doing something to me and hurting me or harming me, or the universe is like, I get frustrated by that. So, and that's not even my strength in my personality, but all of us have access to these two sensing functions somewhere inside of our own psyche. And so as you're listening along or you're watching, think and tune into your own life right now. What would you say extroverted sensing or sensation is for you, no matter where it is in your cognitive function stack and inside your personality? We're talking about this outside of your personality for a moment here. It is the preferred function of all SPs in the Myers-Briggs system. But let's say you're not an SP, or you are, wherever this falls for you, what is it? Is it more of a holistic nature of that sensation or extroverted sensing, or do you have more of a holistic bent? And then if you tune into the memory or the introverted sensing process, what's coming up for you there? Do you think you lean more toward the holistic version of that or the analytic version of this? Mm-hmm. So as you're tuning in, what's coming up for you?
Yeah, I think there's an important thing that he mentions just before we completely close or complete the concept of introverted sensing or memory. This is a really important thing he mentions. He says, when we consider both sides of introverted sensing or memory, we see it as both an anchor and a home for people. That sounds wholesome. And children are impressionable, and a person's childhood is not necessarily wholesome.
Yeah.
So, nor are the impacts necessarily conscious.
Yeah.
So people hold all sorts of attitudes, attractions, and preferences based on impressions provided by family and society, pleasant or not, healthy or not, rational or not.
Yeah.
So we all have introverted sensing or memory, like you just mentioned. So our relationship with it needs to be healthy. It needs to be good. Because we have sense impressions that are in there that we're using all the time to make certain decisions. He uses the example of eating bad sushi one time. Like a difference between, just a quick difference between extroverted sensing and sensation and introverted sensing or memory is that a sensation person might have eaten bad sushi and that was just that experience at that restaurant, but then they go to the next one and they eat sushi and it was fine.
Yeah.
Whereas an introverted sensing or memory user might go, I'm never eating sushi again because it made me really sick.
Yeah.
And so the sense impression is like, I don't care where the sushi comes from. I'm not eating sushi again, right? Because it made me so sick and I hated it, right? We all have the introverted sensing or memory part of us that has had a sense impression that is influencing how we're going through life. So getting in touch with our version of it and recognizing whether or not it's gone into a defender stance or whether or not it's gone into a rollover stance, right? I mean, that's not that the Hearth version is rollover. It's me, so I'm thinking about all the ways that I can improve it. But it's like my relationship to it is important. It doesn't matter what my personality type is.
What I guess the learning or the takeaway I have from that I would articulate is what I think you're saying is that the introverted sensing or memory process in us, no matter who we are, we have that part of us. It is not being judicious on what is being written on the hard drive of itself. Or in other words, like if it was a pristine hard drive, it'll take anything written on it. It's not like it's qualitatively going, well, that's not grandma baking cookie activity, so I'm not going to absorb that into the introverted sensing.
Right.
Like trauma, abuse, like bad stuff happening. Maybe somebody grew up in a war-torn country their entire life for 30 years. That's going to be written on the introverted sensing memory. It's not like it's like we talk about it as a quality of like grandma making cookies or, all the fun holiday traditions and it's wholesome and it's the Hallmark channel. And everybody that has introverted sensing wants to watch Hallmark movies, right? That's not at all what we're saying. We're saying that this process, this mental process is completely open to being written with any material on top of it. And so that can look like anything based on the person's experience they grew up with.
Yeah. And when we go through the personality life path program, which we do deep inner work using functions as a guide.
Yeah.
It is very common, particularly for NJ types.
Man, you're not kidding. I know exactly where you're going with this.
Yeah, but it's very important for people to have to really know whether or not they have a healthy relationship to their introverted sensing or memory. And a lot of times that's the work they need to do.
It's the most emotional week in the entire program that we have.
Yeah.
I would say, even more than the 2 feeling functions. People have more emotional experience when we talk about that part of their life.
Yep. Yeah, because it is their life. It's the sense impression of their life.
Yeah. And
so it's important. It's important for us to know what our relationship is with it. And he also makes a little note. There is huge variance in people who have SJ preferences when being brain scanned.
Yeah.
Right. And so
the most variance of all the functions. It's the most uniquely wired.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is not a monolithic function.
Yeah.
Right. It's one that has a lot of texture. And it's very unique to the individual. And so, so knowing, like having a little bit more self-awareness around one's relationship to this function inside of themselves, I think is crucial.